Hello and welcome to Sake Revolution, America's first sake podcast. I'm your host, John Puma, and I run a website called thesakenotes.com.
And I'm your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake educator and brand ambassador, as well as running the Urban Sake website. And together, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake.
As somebody who loves all things sake, I cannot wait to get into it. What are we doing today, Tim?
Well, in our sake education corner, we're going to be learning about sake ingredients today. You know, sake really just uses a few ingredients, and today we're going to learn all about what it takes to make premium sake.
And then we brought some sake, and we're going to taste it. Another great one, and this one is actually a pretty big deal.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Well, Google likes to translate this one as Mack Daddy, but the rest of the world calls it Kudoki Jozu.
Kudoki Jozu. Well, I'm not Google Translate, but my translation for Kudoki Jozu is actually good at flirting.
I've heard similar phrasing. I've heard ladies' man,
Lover boy.
Lover, but the Mac Daddy one really stuck with me. So that's my go-to.
Hard to forget.
It is very hard to forget.
All right, so that's what we're going to be tasting today.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
But I think we need to get our education in first before we start sipping.
Right. So let's talk about what actually goes into making sake as far as ingredients are concerned. I think people are sometimes surprised to learn that there's really only a few things that go into sake.
Right.
So do you know what they are?
Sake is rice, water, and yeast. And occasionally, if you're making a ginjo, brewer's alcohol.
And there's one other ingredient we need.
Koji?
That's right.
Oh,
Koji.
okay.
That's the one I think that people who did not grow up in Japan are the least familiar with. So let's talk about these briefly. So water, if you pick up a bottle of sake, 80% of what's in that bottle is water. So water has a big impact on the overall impression of a sake. And at a very high level, you can just consider there being like hard water and soft water in Japan. Hard water is more mineral rich. Soft water is less mineral rich. And they produce different styles of sake generally.
Right. And I'm assuming that if a brewery is getting their water from like mountain water, it's probably going to be a little softer. If they're doing it from the ground, it's probably going to be a little harder.
That's right. Well water is often used by some breweries, and that water's been underground for a long time, picking up lots of minerals, hanging out with the rocks and the dirts and all that stuff. Whereas snowmelt water or mountain stream water usually spends less time underground and has a lighter, less minerally body to it. Yeah. So that's the first big ingredient. And, brewers are very proud of their water. You've visited breweries before, and very often they have you taste their water. It's a big deal.
Yeah. Last year, I actually had an opportunity. There was a bar that I was in Fukuoka that was, they had a sake. They just got in. They were very proud of it. They were very excited. So they were doing pourings of it. And then after that, or on the side, they were giving us glasses of the water from the brewery that was used to make the sake.
That's kind of amazing.
It was the first time I ever experienced something like that, and I was like, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's such a great idea.
Fantastic. So that's water. One of the next ingredients is yeast. Mm-hmm. And if you know anything about wine or beer, you know what yeast does. Yeast is a microorganism, and I call it the engine of fermentation. It is the microorganism that actually creates the alcohol. Yeast eats sugar and gives off alcohol and CO2. So if you want to make wine, beer, or sake, you need a specific type of yeast that's going to give you alcohol.
So it's creating CO2. So we've just learned that sake is not carbon neutral.
I don't know how I feel about that, but
it's a small price to pay.
Yes. Okay, so that's I think a lot of people know what yeast is, and they're very familiar with that. So the next ingredient we can talk about is sake rice. So sake rice is different from eating rice. Do you know what the difference is between eating rice and sake rice?
Well, I know that the sake rice is going to be a little more designed to, and by design I mean like grown to have a starchy core, whereas the eating rice that's not going to be very flavorful for the average person eating rice. Right. So when you're actually cultivating eating rice, you're doing the exact opposite.
Yeah. So you're right on target there. Rice generally has three main components to it. We've got starch, fats, and protein. And if we look at the structure of the grain, as you mentioned, for sake rice, it's cultivated in such a way that the starch concentrates in the center of the grain. The outer layers contain the fats and the proteins. I often tell, when I'm teaching classes, I tell my students to think about a grain of sake rice almost like a hard-boiled egg. You have your yolk in the middle, that would be the starchy core, and the egg white on the outside would be where most of the fats and proteins are. It's not a perfect analogy, but
I mean, it's close.
Just to picture it. Well, why do we want starch in the center of the grain? What's so important about that? Why would rice be cultivated in that way? Dun, dun, dun. Well, the reason for that is we want to isolate that starch. The fats and proteins are something we generally want to remove. So if they're more on the outside of the grain, we can mill the rice, or we can polish it down, remove the outer layers, and isolate that starch in the center. So that's one reason that sake rice is cultivated in such a way that the starch is in the core. So milling away the outer layers of the rice grain, isolating the starch in the center, is one of the key concepts in understanding sake.
And that ties into what we spoke about last time, which is milling, which is literally, milling away those outer layers so that you can get to that shimpaku in the center.
That's right. In episode 1, we talked about rice milling and seimai buai, or the rice milling percentage, and that's exactly right. So the rice starch is in the center, and that's the key point. If you were to look inside a grain of eating rice, the starches, fats, and proteins would be more equally distributed. You wouldn't get that true noticeable concentration of starch in the center.
Now, have you ever eaten sake rice?
I have,
and
it doesn't taste balanced.
Oh, okay.
When we eat eating rice or table rice, you get a good balance of starch, fats, and proteins, and it tastes like normal rice. I often make the analogy to wine grapes. I don't know if have you ever been to a vineyard?
I've been to a vineyard, but I don't think I ate any of the grapes while I was there.
Yeah, sometimes if you go out into the field and you grab a Pinot Noir grape off the vine, I can tell you they are not tasty. They're not yummy. They're usually very, very high in sugar, and they have very thick skins. And they're not meant for munching, and snacking on. And it's the same with sake rice. It has a disproportionate amount of starch. And if you cook it up and eat it, of course it's edible and there's some nutrition there, but it tastes out of balance. It doesn't taste good for just snacking on.
Okay.
And usually it's very sticky due to the high starch concentration.
Well, remind me not to put sake rice in my next rice bowl.
Okay. Well, it's very, very expensive too, so I don't think we have to worry about that.
Good.
All right. So that leaves us with one more ingredient for most sakes, and that is koji. Now, do you know what koji is?
I have an understanding of what koji is, and that is that it's essentially the rice plus spores.
Spores. Mold. Yes. Yeah. So hold on to your hats, everyone at home. We actually use mold in making sake. People are sometimes surprised to learn this and freak out a little bit.
First the CO2 thing, and now the
mold. Exactly. But this is
we're crushing dreams today, Tim.
This is a friendly, healthy, delicious mold. When people freak out about mold, I always say, well, have you ever had blue cheese in your life? That's a mold as well. So there are friendly, healthy, delicious molds out there. And koji mold is one of them. Before we talk about what we do with it, do you know what the purpose of the mold is?
I'm going to assume it's going to be spurring the yeast cultivation that we talked about earlier, but I could be way off on this.
Well, the purpose of the mold is actually to break down starch into sugar.
Okay.
So to do alcoholic fermentation, we need sugar, and then the yeast is going to eat the sugar and give off the alcohol and CO2. But the way starch is concentrated in the rice grain, it's unfermentable starches. So we need a way to break down those starches into sugar. So for beer and for sake, we do a two-step fermentation. So grain starches get converted into sugar, and then sugar gets converted into alcohol. So it's a two-step fermentation.
So sake is much more akin to beer as far as in the creation of it than it is to, say, like wine.
Absolutely. Both beer and sake are two-step fermentation process, and wine is a one-step fermentation process. Grapes already have the sugar, so there's no need to create the sugar to make the alcohol. So the way that this mold works is, you were right, we grow the mold, we propagate the mold onto sake rice. So basically, over the course of 2 days in a very warm room, We grow the mold on the sake rice, and we get moldy rice. People wonder, what does it look like? Well, it's like little white fuzzy surface on the rice grain. And, you can eat it. It's perfectly safe to eat.
You see that? I have eaten.
Yes. All right. So,
I have eaten koji.
yeah. What was your impression eating the koji?
It was actually kind of cool. I thought it was a little sweet. It was nice. It was totally edible.
Yeah. Some people describe it as having like a chestnut aroma, like a nutty aroma. And I've often described eating the molded koji rice as like crunching on trail mix or granola. It kind of had that, not much moisture left in it.
Yeah.
And a little bit crunchy.
Yeah, it was definitely a little, but it wasn't like crunchy, like completely uncooked rice. It was just, it was somewhere in between. It was nice.
Right. Yeah. So the mold is grown on the rice grain, and then that molded rice is put into the fermentation mash. And the secret is this: the mold gives off an enzyme that breaks down starch into sugar. So the reason we grow the mold on this rice and then put it into the fermentation tank is that this gives us an enzyme that will break down the starches that are in the tank and convert them into sugar. And then the yeast is sitting there ready to eat the sugar and create the alcohol. So we have that two-step fermentation process. And without the koji, we wouldn't have the enzyme to get the starches broken down. So that's the role of the koji.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, but there is one more ingredient that's used in some sakes, but not all sake.
Yeah, and that I believe it would be the brewer's alcohol.
Brewer's alcohol. That's right. So brewer's alcohol is a distillate. So it's a distilled alcohol, and the vast majority of brewers are going to use a distillate of sugarcane. And it is a completely neutral spirit. And some sakes are fortified with this distilled alcohol, and some are not. So it's an optional ingredient. It's allowed by the law in Japan to add a certain amount of distilled alcohol. And why would brewers want to do that?
My understanding is that it really helps capture aroma in a nice way.
Yes, adding distilled alcohol can really affect the texture of a sake, and it can release additional aroma compounds, boost aromas, and it can also release, it can help some rice dissolve that doesn't dissolve on its own. So it's a way to release additional flavors, boost aromas, and kind of really round out the texture, make a texture more silky.
Nice.
Yeah.
And that goes for that's only the law in Japan. My understanding is that the law in America is a little bit different, and you cannot introduce brewer's alcohol here.
Well, that's a good point. For people who are making sake in the U.S., you have to have a distiller's license in addition to a brewer's license or a winery license, depending on your state, to make this alcohol added, this fortified style of sake.
What if you're not the one actually making the alcohol?
That doesn't matter.
Really?
You can't add it to your product without the distiller's license. That's my understanding.
That's so. I mean, you're right, but in my head, I'm just like, that makes no sense. It's like,
well,
you're not distilling.
Welcome to the wonderful world of alcohol laws in the United States.
I don't get me wrong.
It's a patchwork of 50 weird situations.
Yeah.
So those are our ingredients. We have the water, yeast, sake rice, and koji, and then the optional addition of distilled alcohol. So every sake you're ever going to drink is either the fortified kind or the non-fortified kind. So that's a good first step when you're determining what kind of sake you're drinking. You can ask yourself, is this fortified style or not? Because all sake is going to fall into one of those two categories.
Great.
Yeah.
And that's something we'll get into a little more in the future.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep. So I think that's a really good foundation for talking about what the raw materials are for making sake.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And all this talk about what makes sake has me wanting to taste some sake.
I think that's a good idea. So we talked a little bit during the intro about Mack Daddy / lover boy. Mack Daddy / lover boy / good at flirting.
Ladies man.
Ladies man.
All these synonyms. I'm sure. I imagine if you're hearing this, you get the general concept of what they're going for here.
Okay, so we have poured the Kudoki Jozu into our glasses, and again, as we mentioned in the first episode, we're using wine glasses to taste this.
Yeah, and I think that'll be a consistent theme for us. Is that wine glasses are great for sake, You probably have them at home. You have a new use for them now.
Yes. And they're great for studying sake too, because you can see the color. You can hold the stem without warming the glass with your hand. And you can swirl it to activate the aroma. Just overall a good thing. Okay, so the brand name is Kudoki Jozu, which honestly, my literal translation is good at flirting. So Jozu means being good at something, and Kudoki's kind of like playful flirting.
Okay.
Is there an official translation from the brewery?
I don't think there is.
Okay.
How about this? If there is, I have not seen it, and I've been a big fan of this sake for years.
Yes. So the label has a very old kind of drawing of a Japanese geisha.
In a state of undress.
Yes, with a bare shoulder.
Right.
Very alluring. So that is the cover art for this sake. So what I like to do when I get a sake in my glass, the first thing I like to do is just give it a smell. So why don't we give this a little smell? All right. So I'm getting some fruitiness, but it smells like overripe fruitiness. Like, you know, when bananas sit for a couple days and they have that very ripe banana smell, or when melon is you've had fruit salad in your fridge for a couple days and you open up the fruit salad, it has that very intense melony smell. That's kind of what I get when I smell this.
I'm simply similar with that. I get the fruit salad reference. I don't know if I'm not quite on the overripe, but maybe that's because I've had some bad experiences with overripe fruit, so I try not to think about that. But I do think of it as very very vibrant, bright.
Yes.
Like there's a lot on the nose here, and it's a positive thing.
Maybe instead of saying overripe, we could say rich fruits.
Okay.
Like, yeah.
I like that.
Concentrated. Yeah. That's lovely. So let's give it a taste. That's yummy.
Yeah.
So again, I think this is one, I don't know if you agree, John, but I think this is one sake where the aroma and the taste really line up.
Right. I mean, this is, well balanced in that way. Like you're very much getting the aroma is setting you up for the taste, and when you taste it, it's that payoff is right there.
Yep. And we talked about the sake ingredients, and one of the main ingredients, of course, was sake rice. And there is a sake rice used for this sake called Miyama Nishiki.
Right.
There's about 100 varieties of sake rice that are registered with the Japanese government. So this is one variety of sake rice we'll be talking about in the future.
There's 100?
There's 100, yeah.
I had no idea there were that many.
Yep.
I thought maybe like 25, 30 on the outside.
No, the 100 are not used all the time.
Right.
And some breweries also use eating rice to make sake.
True.
So, but if you look at the varieties that are officially, registered with the government, there's 100.
Oh.
And so this uses, again, the name of that is Miyama Nishiki. And you can just make note of that. We'll talk about that more in the future. And we talked about seimai buai, or rice milling percentage, in episode 1. And the milling rate for Kudoki Jozu is 50%.
So it's right in the middle. They take half of the grain away.
They take half of the grain away, but 50% or less remaining is the entry to super premium quality. So this is way more than in the middle. This is really at the pinnacle.
True.
Yeah. So normally, most sakes would not make it to this low milling rate. So this is quite a luxurious treatment for the rice for this Kudoki Jozu. Wonderful. So how would you describe the overall texture of this sake?
Well,
Maybe we need another sip.
I think we do.
Yeah. Okay. I have thoughts. What are your thoughts about the texture?
It's actually very light in texture. It's it's not dissimilar from water to me in that way. It's not, it's there's not a big luxurious like velvety mouthfeel on this like some other sakes we talked about in the past. This is kind of, it's just kind of there. I'm not blown away by the texture. Is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think the texture is just a bit under what I would call medium bodied. So it's on the lighter side. The finish is quite short and not too lingering. For something that is this fruity, you might expect it to have a long lingering, what I call a wine-like finish that really kind of coats your palate a little bit more. But this one is just under medium bodied for me. And I find it really pleasant.
It is pleasant. I don't mean to. I'm not ragging on it by saying that the texture didn't wow me. Not every texture has to, in my opinion, because there are so many other things to love about this sake, and it is very well balanced. It's just that I'm getting great flavor. But on occasion, especially when I'm having a sake that's where the rice is milled to 50%, sometimes I want to just wrap myself in it for a little bit. And because it's so light, it's a little more difficult to do that.
Yep. So is that something you generally prefer in sakes? You like them richer, bolder?
Well, I like my texture. I like a mouthfeel that's going to be big and really just coat my mouth and be something I can linger on while I'm sipping it.
Well, it's good to learn that about you now at the beginning of our podcast.
Yeah.
I tend to like things that are a little bit lighter, cleaner, and leaner. That's generally my style that I like.
I still like clean, but it's hard. It's a muddy situation because sometimes you get a portion of that, and sometimes you don't. And you'll get too much of one way and not enough fruitiness.
Yeah, but for Kudoki Jozu, I think we can agree that it's a little bit on the leaner side.
Yeah,
and the finish is a little bit shorter.
Very much so.
Yeah, it doesn't linger too much.
It just kind of ends.
Yeah, and that is just as difficult to achieve as a long lingering finish. So I have great respect for both styles of sake. I worked in a brewery for 1 year, and learning how to achieve these different profiles, one is not necessarily easier than the other. So to get that really cleaner finish takes just as much finesse as doing a longer finish.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Wonderful. So what about food pairings for this sake? Do you have any thoughts? I have a few ideas.
Well, I mean, as is the usual with me, this is a very elegant sake, so it's a thing I would prefer to sip and try to not interfere with as far as the food goes. But so nothing with a lot of flavor, nothing big and bold. I don't want this anywhere near my Thai food. Maybe this would pair very nicely with some very light sushi like nigiri, but I wouldn't go too much further than that. And nothing, because I don't want the food to outpace the flavor of the sake. It's very elegant, it's very light, and I feel like it can get overshadowed very easily by strong flavor.
Yeah. So I have two thoughts. One is that this is a sake that I would almost really prefer as an aperitif type sake, like a welcome sake if you're coming to a dinner party, or if you're coming home after work and you want a glass of sake to unwind and you don't need any snacks with it. This is really perfect for that. Don't you agree?
I think that's how I consume like 80% of my sake. not the aperitif, but the on the couch after a long day at work.
Yes.
And that's probably why I'm attracted to this style so much.
Yes.
And, because it's really doing that. It is it's a great sake to just sip on.
Yeah, I think if you have that richer style of sake and you want something easy breezy after work, that richer style we were talking about is not a good fit for that. Your palate can get kind of tired out if it's too rich, too heavy. So this is like a little bit more breezy, a little bit lighter, has delightful fruitiness on the palate, and it's just great for that, after work, relaxing sake. When it comes to food, I think about, one issue that wine has pairing with food is that there's a lot of difficulty with what I refer to as the bitter green vegetables, like asparagus, artichoke. So different types of salad components can sometimes be difficult to pair with wine. And I think sake really fits in that niche very, very well. These are lighter dishes that are more greens and salad based. They sometimes have a bitter back note to them. And I think that a sake like this fits that bill really, really perfectly. And I also agree with your point about sushi or sashimi. I think that the nose is restrained enough not to interfere too much with the enjoying the fish. So I would go with appetizer style salads, greens, and also sushi sashimi.
So we have not found, this is not our pair with American meals sake.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I mean, if I was someone who ate salad for lunch every day, this might be a good. If you have salad for dinner, that's not really my style. But if you have salad for dinner, it should be, but it's not.
I have salad for lunch at work often, but I can't have. If I bring sake to the office, they look at me really funny.
Just put it in an Evian bottle; you'll be fine. It's a slippery slope. All right. So wow, I'm getting hungry. That sounds good.
Yeah. I think we succeeded.
Yeah. So I think this is just an overall wonderful, wonderful sake. Just so easy to enjoy.
It is, and it is very easy drinking. It's easy to like. It's easy to put in front of somebody who's never had sake before and be like, oh hey, why don't you try this? 9 out of 10 times, people are going to be blown away because people don't know sake can do this.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons we're doing the podcast, is to get the word out that this good stuff is out there.
Yeah, if only you guys can taste this. You have to go find some.
Yes. Well, if people do want to find this sake, what should they do?
Well, we have compiled a small list of usually online retailers that are going to be very willing to make their best effort to deliver sake to you. And you're going to find all of that in the show notes and at the website.
That's right. So if you visit sakerevolution.com and reference episode 2, you'll find our show notes there, and we will outline places where you can buy Kudoki Jozu, Mack Daddy, Lover Boy, Good at Flirting, Junmai Ginjo, Delicious Sake.
Yeah, and we actually would like to hear your translation of what the sake name means.
So drink a whole bottle.
Yes, and then just let us know.
Let the creative juices flow. And send us your recommendation for what this should be called. Wonderful. Well, I think that is a wonderful place to move on and wrap up our episode 2.
Yeah. So thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure that you go ahead and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And really for keeping things visible, do rate us. It helps a lot more than I'm willing to admit. And Tim?
Absolutely. And to learn more about any of the topics we talked about, any of the education or any of the sakes we talked about in today's episode, visit our show notes at sakerevolution.com and look at episode 2.
So if you want to send us feedback or show ideas, or if you want to let us know what your translation of Kudoki Jozu is, send it over to feedback@sakerevolution.com.
So until next time, remember to keep drinking sake and kanpai!